So I want to share with you something that was shared with me. Missy passed a book along to me by a guy named Overman, and I want to give him credit for some of the things we'll be talking about tonight. He makes some really great points, and at one point he starts with a riddle. It's not necessarily a ha-ha riddle, but just kind of an interesting thought. And the question is, what do a carpenter, a cook, and a pilot all have in common? And the answer is that they all depend on objective instruments to do their job. A carpenter relies on these instruments, and a cook has his own instruments, and a pilot the same. They rely on different ways to measure the situation so that they can complete their task. And that's because the carpenter, the cook, and the pilot are all limited on their own. Their senses, their ability to hear and see, and all our other senses that go with that, it can only help them so far. Eventually, I guess there's some cooks and pilots and carpenters that can kind of eye it and guesstimate, as they say, but there is a point when they need to know exactly what's going on. They're going to rely on an objective source of measurement. And the same is true for all of us. And I really like this analogy. I think it's very helpful. It reminded me of, I shared a story with you a while back about my cousin who is a pilot. He flies for United now, but he flew jets for the Air Force a long time ago. In fact, he's one of the speakers that will be coming here in July. And he flew jets for the Air Force, and during his training, time and time again, his instructors would say, trust your instruments. No matter what you think is going on outside the cockpit, whatever you see, whatever you have guessed is what's going on, trust your instruments. They just drilled this into Mike over and over again, because what would happen is they're doing maneuvers pretty fast. Many pilots would end up flying upside down, and in some circumstances, when you're above the water and you're looking at the clouds, it's hard to tell up from down, a lot more than you might think. And there have been many cases where a pilot would come out of a roll and end up flying upside down and thinking that this was down. And even though the instruments said otherwise, when it came time to make the next move, a lot of pilots paid with it for their lives, not trusting their instruments, and they would pull up into the ocean, and they would die. And this happened often, so the instructors were always saying, no matter what you think's going on, trust your instruments. A lot of people would turn upside down and get it all backwards. This is exactly what happened to Mike. He was in maneuvers at one point, and he came out of it and was flying upside down. As far as he was concerned, he was right side up. Every fiber of his being, every bone in his body was telling him that he was right side up. But because the voice of his instructor came to mind, said, don't rely on your senses, trust your instruments. And that's why he lives to tell the tale today, is because he did trust his instruments and went the exact opposite direction that his gut instinct told him to. So the same is true when it comes to our spiritual decisions. If you rely on your heart alone and just kind of guess your way through life, if you just use your senses, it's inevitable it's going to result in disaster. Especially when it comes to the soul, we need some kind of objective way to measure the situation. And we know from Jeremiah 17:9, Jeremiah 17:9 tells us the heart is more deceitful than all else. If you want to find something deceptive on this planet, look to your heart. Doesn't mean you never consider its input. That would be a sad life, but you don't let it call the shots. That is not your trustworthy source of information. And in fact, the heart is notorious not for just getting it wrong, but the heart tends to get it backwards, just like the jet pilot, up looks down and down looks up. Proverbs 14:12, often used in lessons along these lines. There's a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. That's Proverbs 14:12. And boy, I bet all of us have been in situations where we said, this seems, like the good thing to do. I mean, there's a million songs that say, it feels so right, how can it be wrong? And we kind of trust our instincts and end up in a lot of bad situations. If we want to make sense of this existence, we have to have some kind of measuring device, some kind of absolute standard. But we were kind of talking about this in class this morning. The world is not keen on that idea of having an absolute standard, and it's very offensive in most circles. I'm of the opinion that in most cases people will build their beliefs as they go. It's kind of you collect scraps of ideas. You hear something in a movie, maybe your relatives believe one thing, and a friend said something, and you read something in a poem, and you kind of patch all this together, and that's what you believe. And it's fragments that are collected here and there. And then what happens is, as we live our lives, it's called situation ethics, is you shift according to the situation. You're presented with the situation, and you have no real standard, so there's no definite right or wrong, and you kind of just wing it. And it's very flexible. It just depends on the circumstances. That's why the world has that anthem, as it's just whatever your belief system is, and you adapt. And it's ultimately very inconsistent. And I was getting ready to present this to you, and it hit me that it's kind of funny that the world eagerly jumps forward to point out all the contradictions that they think are in the Bible. There are many people will jump on that bandwagon right away and say, oh yeah, the Bible's filled with contradictions, which we know, a closer look will discover that there are no contradictions. The funny thing about that is that in truth, it's the beliefs of the world that are filled with contradictions. If you let somebody talk long enough about what they believe, very soon even they will see that it doesn't quite match up. I just find it kind of sadly funny that the very ones who are pointing your finger at the Bible have their own minds filled with so many inconsistencies. If their brain was a book, it'd be so easy to find out where those lie. Just the bumper sticker "coexist" is a tribute to contradiction. So you can imagine if you applied this flexibility of standards to everything. What if an inch, just that simple measurement, changed depending on the day? On some days it was longer, some days it was shorter. Or if the length of a minute changed, how would that work for us? But we have standards when it comes to these things. We already know how much fun it is that the value of the dollar is kind of shifting. I learned something not too long ago. Before 1939, there was no standard for music. So a violinist from Germany and a violinist from France, they could both be tuned, but if they got together, they would be not matched to the same A. There was no standard. And so they would both play different A's. They were both right, but they both had their own tuning system, kind of like a lot of belief systems. And then in 1939, someone suggested, hey, if we want to play together here, we got to have some kind of standard. And they established a particular frequency and said, this is A from now on. When you hear an orchestra tune, the guy taps the stand, and they're all kind of making a commotion, and then you hear one instrument sound, and then everybody else chimes in. That's the oboe, and it always plays an A, and it always plays the same A, because that's the standard. If not, there would be chaos. That is the standard by which all music is played or sung. The more serious the circumstances, that's just music. But when you're dealing with serious circumstances, the more you need a standard. When it comes to life and death, you don't want someone who's following their heart. I loved, Eflegard Smith was speaking one time, and he said, we don't mind free thinkers and I guess liberals in general. He says, but when it comes to our pilots, we don't want them with the kind that have ponytails. And he wasn't bashing ponytails. But what he's pointing out is when it comes to life and death, we want someone who's solid. You don't want someone up in the cockpit who stays loose. We need a solid, reliable standard. So in contrast to what the world offers, James chapter 1:17 gives a major contrast to this, compared to the world's shifting standards. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. The world is filled with stuff that's constantly changing, adapting, very flexible depending on what's going on. The world is all about shifting shadows, but not God. He is the constant. He is the standard. And he's provided us a way to get the measurements we need. That's kind of what this is. You know where I'm headed with this. We get the measurements we need to get our job done, to get safely to heaven. The Bible does not shift. It does not move. And I think that's one reason why the world rages against it. It is very offensive to their sense of what's right and wrong. In fact, Jesus describes himself as a stone. I think this is worthwhile to take our time to look at 1 Peter 2. So keeping in mind how much the world is like shifting shadows, here's 1 Peter 2, verse 4. And Jesus describes himself as a stone in this passage, but he's making the point that people are going to treat him differently depending on their approach to this stone. 1 Peter 2, starting with verse 4. And coming to him as to a living stone, which has been rejected by men, so there's that rejection going on, but is choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value, then, is for you who believe. But for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they were also appointed. So notice he's saying, I'm like the stone. Jesus is the stone. And to some, to Christians, he's the cornerstone. And that means a cornerstone of a building is the standard by which all other stones in the building will measure themselves. In order to fit into the building, you have to match that first stone and be of the same style and shape. But there will also be those who reject that idea and do not transform to him. And there will be problems. All of us have encountered pain in the dark when you try to walk across a room and you bump into something. One that came to my mind, my Uncle Dave, he was talking about walking across a warehouse, and there was a forklift in the dark. And the fork, that heavy fork part was sticking out, and he caught it with his shin. And I remember him describing it, and he said, and that forklift didn't move at all. And there was much pain. God doesn't move at all. His word doesn't move at all. So every soul has the option of being transformed to be like him, the image of his son, to fit next to him, to become part of the eternal purpose, or you will encounter an immovable object. You will trip over him. From the outside, a lot of people look in at Christianity and describe faith in terms of darkness or blindness. And you hear terms such as blind faith and a leap of faith. And I think the general idea is people think that most of us are covering our eyes and just hoping that this is true. It sounds like a good idea, and so we get together to convince each other that this is a good plan. We're just kind of crossing our fingers. And of course, that's not the case. It's more of a rational decision than that. We're weighing it on the evidence. But I would say that in a sense, there is some blindness involved. Chance read Hebrews 11:1 for us. Is a very definition of faith. And I've been very quick in the past saying, no, faith is not blind. But I guess you could say it is to a certain extent, because here's the definition in Hebrews 11, verse 1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So there it is, things not seen. It is blindness. We only see so much. Our senses are limited. We see this physical realm, but there's far much more to existence than what we see. But notice before that, there's also assurance. It's not blind in the sense of just hopeful thinking or wishful thinking. And that's because since we can't see, this assurance comes from the fact that we rely on someone who can. The same book that Missy shared with me by Overman, he told a true story that really stuck with me. In fact, I think it stuck in her mind as well, because it was the one thing that kind of came up in conversation. In 1928, there was an ocean liner docked at New York City. It had pulled up, and some reporters were there to interview somebody who was coming off the boat. The ship had crossed the Atlantic and had come from Europe. And there was a young man on board. His name was Morris Frank. So this is 1928. And Morris Frank had been to Switzerland, and he was returning to the U.S. He was from the United States. He had traveled to Switzerland, and he's coming back. And strangely enough, Morris Frank had gone to Switzerland to get a dog. And it was a female German Shepherd named Buddy. That kind of throws me. It's a dog, a female dog named Buddy. And I know some of you have gone to get dogs, but I don't think you've gone to Switzerland. So he went to Switzerland to get this German Shepherd, this female German Shepherd named Buddy. What was unusual about the situation is that Morris Frank was blind, and Buddy was a seeing eye dog. Buddy was the first seeing eye dog to come to the U.S. I guess it all kind of started in Switzerland. I guess the idea of training dogs to see for people. So Buddy thought Buddy probably thought it was a good idea too. Morris Frank thought that was a great idea, and so he went to get this dog, and her name was Buddy, and she would be the first seeing eye dog to come to the United States. But it was bigger than that. Morris had a plan for this dog. He was bringing her back because he was going to open a training school for guide dogs, and it would be the first of its kind in the United States. And he was going to start with this German Shepherd. She would be the first. So when Morris and Buddy came off the ship, they stepped off the ship, there's quite a hubbub. All the reporters are there waiting to talk to him. And they're interviewing him about his plan, about his ideas for the school, and it's all very exciting. And there he is in New York City. And finally, one reporter asked him, he said, so this dog is pretty trustworthy? And Morris was like, absolutely. And this reporter said, can Buddy take you anywhere? He said, yes. And then the reporter said, how about, can Buddy take you across West Street? And I don't know, it didn't say this, but I think there's probably a pause there because of what we find out. So in 1928, I guess the New Yorkers there had a nickname for West Street. They called it Death Street. And so, from what I understand, it was an incredibly wide cobblestone street. Very, very wide. Taxis were on it. Draft horses, those big horses, were pulling wagons. And a lot of 10-ton trucks. Just a 1-ton truck would be enough, but it's 10-ton trucks are going up and down this street. And to make it even more fun, there were no traffic lights. It was considered one of the most dangerous streets in the country. And so when this reporter, I don't know if he was joking or not, or just kind of pushing things, when he asked, do you think you could trust Buddy to lead you across West Street? I imagine there was silence, and maybe Morris had to think about it, but he had to prove what seeing eye dogs could do, and so he took the challenge. He said, yes. He says, yes, you can. Yes, my dog can get me across Death Street. But this was risking a lot, because if he even got hurt, the whole world, the reporters are there, the whole world would ultimately know about it, and his school wouldn't have a chance. He's putting his future on the line as well as his life. So Morris got a firm grip on his dog, and he started across Death Street. Wouldn't it be a sad story if I told you I didn't make it? But here's what I guess Morris wrote about this, and he said it was like, he said when I took a hold of Buddy and we started across, he said it was like entering a wall of sound. Now keep in mind he's blind. And he said Buddy went 4 steps and stopped. And he said he heard this roar and felt a rush of hot air, and it was a huge truck passing right in front of him. In fact, he said if Buddy had lifted her nose, she would have been able to touch this truck that passed in front of him. Then Buddy led him forward, then stopped. Then she backed up, and then forward again. And this is his words again. He says, I lost all sense of direction and surrendered myself entirely to the dog. And it took him about 3 minutes to cross Death Street. And along the way, there were taxis, of course, going back and forth, and more trucks and drivers yelling at him, honking. And when they reached the other side safely, Morris knelt down and gave Buddy a big hug. And then he heard a voice next to him, right next to him. And this voice said, "She sure is a good girl." And it turned out to be one of the photographers. And this photographer said, "I had to come over in a cab. And some of the fellows who tried to cross with you are still back on the other side." I really like this analogy. You like true stories, but it's an analogy that's very, almost frighteningly appropriate to our situation. You and I have to cross Death Street in the truest sense of the word. We can't see our way. These are things that are not seen. And on our own, we will never make it. But God has given us His Word. Can you imagine getting up and spending one day without that guidance? Just one day. Can you imagine? How about a week or a lifetime just kind of trusting your own sense of direction when you can't see the safe way to go? But God has given us His Word. It really comes down to just a simple matter of whether or not you're going to trust it. If the Word says go forward, we go. If the Word says stop, we stop. If it says back up, we back up. Otherwise, there's that option, but really there's only one other option. I know the world presents the idea that there's a whole salad bar of beliefs for you to choose from, but there really is only one other choice, and you can read it in Romans 1:21. If you choose not to use this instrument of measurement, the Bible, to get you safely across, here's your other option in Romans 1:21. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. In other words, they guessed. Faith, I guess you could say, is blind, but the world is blinder. You can put it that way. Faith is blind, but it has the assurance of the Word. What does the world have? Your instinct, your good guesses. Without faith, you will cross on your own. And we are all blind. Our senses can only help us so long. And now it's just a matter of who you're going to rely on to get you to the other side. We're in the middle of crossing Death Street. If you follow God's Word closely, you will reach the other side just fine. And I hope that we'll all take this to heart as we stand together and sing.